All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our annual TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Tavshin Pehei 5785, the Tilson Mishpacha of Am Yisroel, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this year as a zechus for besuros, tovos for Am Yisroel. Our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Teves, the Kelman Family in memory of Amit Ben David Levy, brother of Itay Levy, who was killed in Gaza, Kiddush Hashem, on the first night of Chanukah. We hope that in the merits of our TALMUD TORAH, the Shem will have an aliyah and his family in Nechama. Our week of learning sponsors, Zevi and Shoshy Daniel, nishmas, Zevi's father, Yitzchak Yisrael ben Refoel Noach Yosef, zichron livracha. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the nishmas will have an aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah shtav, together with Kol Chole Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should bring home our hostages, b'shalom and b'karav, and our holy soldiers should be successful. With that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Chaf Dalet 24. We are picking up on Chaf Gimel Amud Beis 23b. Ki Asa Rabdimi. We actually began this yesterday, about 14 lines up from the bottom. Ki Asa Rabdimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Machlokes v'shtei kitei edim. The Machlokes in Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is dealing actually with two sets of witnesses. Now, we began to read this Rashi yesterday. Rashi explained what's happening over here is as follows. So Reuven has a din Torah against Shimon, right? And Reuven claims that he has two sets of witnesses to support his particular claim. Okay, so the Gemara says Rabbi Meir Savar Tzarach Levarer. Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maisa, if Reuven claims that he has two witnesses, there's an obligation to go ahead and verify those two sets. Take a quick look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says it's actually right across. Machlokes b'shtei kitei edim, shamar bal din bifanenu, yesh li shtei kitei edim. So Reuven says, I have two sets of, not one set of witnesses, but two sets of witnesses to support my claim. So what happened? So the Gemara says, Hevi kat rishona va'avat halova, va'amar va'acher, va'amar psulini. So now what happens? Reuven brings his two sets of witnesses. And now what happens? The other litigant, Shimon, and another person come along and combine to claim that the first set are psulin. Are psulin. This is the Gemara Va'amar. Va'ar psulin dahash talav kinogeh be'edosu shari amar malva shishli kat acheres. So remember again, in yesterday's daf we were speaking about the ability for one litigant to go ahead and disqualify the witnesses of the other litigant. Now the Gemara says the inherent problem with that was that if, let's say, for example, if Shimon wants to disqualify the witnesses of Reuven, how could that be? Because isn't Shimon what we call nogeh b'davar? Isn't he, what was the word that we used for nogeh b'davar? Isn't he conflict of interest? I'm sorry? Conflict, right? Doesn't he have an inherent conflict of interest? Right? By trying to disqualify the very witnesses that are there to testify against him. So now the Gemara suggesting over here is maybe a case where Reuven claims that he has two sets of witnesses. He comes for the first. Shimon testifies along with another against the first set of witnesses. Maybe Shimon is not a nogeh b'davar. Why? Because at the end of the day, there's a second set of witnesses still there. Reuven has a second set. So because Reuven has a second set, perhaps it's not a conflict of interest for Shimon to testify against the first set. To finish up the Rashi. So Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, when Reuven claims that he has two sets of witnesses, Reuven is obligated to provide two sets of witnesses. And therefore, even if Shimon comes along and testifies against the first set, Shimon should be believed because it's not a nogeh b'davar, because halacha l'maisa, there's still a second set. Back to the Gemara. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, hold that no, just because you say that you have two sets of witnesses, doesn't mean that you're obligated to furnish two sets of witnesses. L'maisa, again, all you need to support your claim is what? One set of witnesses, even though you claimed you have two, that the halacha does not require you to actually produce two. Aval bekat achos, but when it comes to one set of witnesses, everyone agrees that one litigant cannot testify against the witnesses of a second litigant. Okay, interesting. So Amru lefan of Rav Ami Rav Asi. What happens if Reuven only produces one set of witnesses? So halacha l'maisa, again, what happens in that circumstance? So the Gemara says, "Ein sham elakat achos." We already said that. If there's only one set of witnesses, va'amrit aval bekat achos divrei hakol in yochol leposlan. We just explained that if Reuven is bringing one set of witnesses, Shimon cannot testify against the validity of those witnesses. Why? Because Shimon is considered to be a nogea badavar. He's conflicted. He's conflicted in his testimony. Now again, the only time the Gemara says, Aval bekat achas yirakol in yichol leposlan, elanim says kat shnia, krovin o psulin mahu. So what happens if halacha l'mais, however, let's say Shimon does testify against the first set of witnesses. Reuven brings the second set of witnesses, but then it actually turns out that the second set of witnesses are either related or puzzle. What's the halacha? So again, he responded, in that case, what he's supposed to do, kvar idu edim arishonim. Again, so in that case, what he's supposed to do, the first set of witnesses already testified, and Shimon, along with another, already disqualified that first set. Others explain Amravashi, kvar idu edim harishonim. Okay, so we'll say, so remember, just to understand and appreciate what it is that is unfolding over here is very simple. The Mishnah highlighted an interesting machlokes. The Mishnah said, Reuven and Shimon come to a din Torah. The Mishnah said that Reuven brings witnesses, Shimon could disqualify the witnesses. Shimon brings witnesses, Reuven could disqualify the witnesses. The Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim say, no, you can't. No, you can't. The only way to disqualify witnesses is how? Is if it turns out that literally they have an inherent personalistic disqualification, a gambler, a thief, something like that, or they're related. So we're trying to figure out what is that? Right? What is that machlokes? What is the machlokes? We're suggesting the machlokes is where, let's say, for example, Reuven is claiming I have two sets of witnesses. So in that case, Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, because he said there are two sets, he has an obligation to furnish both sets. Therefore, Shimon has the ability to testify about the first set. He's not conflicted because there's still the second set. And the Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim say that even when Reuven claims that he has two sets, he's not obligated to furnish two sets. Rather, again, he's only obligated to furnish one set. Now the Gemara says, Neima, beplukta de Rabbi for Rabbi Shmuel. Say the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim in the Mishnah is the same machlokes between Rabbi and Rabbi Shmuel. What happened? The Sanya, Tahabat lidon, bishtar bechazaka. It's an interesting case. So we'll say, so now let's say, right, Reuven comes along and Reuven finds Shimon living on property that everyone agrees Reuven once owns. Right? So Reuven claims, Shimon, you're a squatter, get out. Shimon claims, now what does Shimon say? Shimon say, I could produce a shtar and I also have chazaka. I've been living here 3 years uncontested. So Shimon has a dual claim of shtar and chazaka. So it says, interesting, Nidon b'shtar divrei. Rebbe says, all he needs to do is furnish the shtar. We don't care about the chazaka. Bring the shtar and we're good to go. Rabbi Shmuel says, Nidon bechazaka. Rabbi Shmuel says, that Allah l'maisa, no, we look at chazaka. So we asked, that means just the chazaka, not the shtar. Ela'ima af bechazaka. Rather say even chazaka. In other words, Rabbi say. So what's happening over here is as follows. Rebbe says, all we look at is shtar. Rabbi Shmuel says, we look at both things. In other words, essentially, if you made a dual claim that you have both chazaka and shtar to support your residency claim, ultimately, again, you have to furnish both of those to support your statement. The Kaimalan, and we said, b'titzarach levara pligi. And I will say, what are they arguing about? So we'll say, it's actually very interesting, and this in general is a fascinating idea. When you make a legal claim, and your legal claim is more than what you needed to say, are you obligated to support that entire claim? Or do we make you just support the bare minimum threshold to meet your legal obligations? So for example, right? So again, Reuven comes along and says, Shimon, you're living in my house. Shimon says, now really all Shimon needs to say is what? Either a shtar or chazaka. You don't need both. But Shimon says, I have a shtar and chazaka. So now what's the shayla? Does Shimon have to furnish both of those things in order to support his claim? Or no, only one of them is enough. So that's the fundamental machlokes over here. We'll say, tremendous Musar Haskell in general, which is, sometimes in life, the less you say, the better. Right? What's so in ours, the less you say, the better, which is a pretty self-explanatory lesson in life that we've all learned. But I will say also, sometimes it's this idea that, what's the expression? Under promise and over deliver. Right? The problem in life is many of us over-promise and under-deliver. Right? So again, here you have Shimon's coming and saying, Shana Chazaka. All right, calm down. Under-promise, in other words, all you need to do is say you have one of them or bring one of them and you could over-deliver. Incredible. So the Gemara says, So the Gemara says fine. Lo, alibi Rabbi Shmuel Silber kulam lo pligi. So the Gemara says according to Rabbi Shmuel Silber, everyone agrees. Keep pligi. Where's the machlokes? Alibi the Rabbi. Rabbi Meir. Machlokes according to Rabbi. Rabbi Meir kirebi. Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi. Rabbi Meir of our Mishnah holds like Rabbi. Rabbanan Amri Lecha, and the Rabbanan will say as follows. Ad kan lo kamer Rabbi Hasam ela bechazaka. Right? Rebbe's only saying his particular position by chazaka. Why? So the Gemara says, D'mikoach shtar ka'asi. Because chazaka itself also is derivative of the koach of shtar. Aval hacha, dahani edim lav mikoach edim achrini ka'asu. But in our case in the Mishnah, where the second set of witnesses have nothing to do with the first set. Afilu Rebbe moda de'in tzarech lebarar. Even Rebbe would agree that halacha l'maisa, you don't have to bring forth both sets. Kiyasa Rabban Amar Rabbi Yochanan Reisha top of Chavdal. So again, we're just continuing on this mission, trying to explain the first case in Mishnah where Rabbi Meir says that one litigant could disqualify the witnesses of the other, and the Rabbanan say no. The only way to disqualify witnesses is halacha l'maisa through some type of true inherent psul. Top of Chavdalid. So the Gemara says Reisha be'edim psulin v'dayanim ksherin. This is interesting. The Reisha first case, the Mishnah is talking about witnesses who are unfit, right, and dayanim and ksherin. So the Gemara says migu de pasli edim pasli nami dayani. So since the edim are invalidated, therefore by definition the witnesses are going to be invalidated as well. Just the opposite. Since we invalidated the witnesses, the judges will be invalidated as well. Seifa, but dayanin psulun ve'edin ksherin. The Seifa is talking about a case where the dayanin have not been invalidated, but the edim, the dayanim have been invalidated, but the edim are ksherin. Demigo the pasli dayanim, pasli nami edim. So Marsa maskif la Ravas. Rava raises a kasha. We'll say Chavdal of 24a, 4 lines down. Maskif la Ravas. Rava raises a kasha. Bishlam amigo the pasli edim, pasli nami dayani. So I understand that in the case where the witnesses have been invalidated, so by extension the judges have been invalidated because Lamaisa is no longer a case. So the Gemara says, but ika beidina achrina. So remember again, there's always another basin that they could go to. Elamigo the pasli dayani pasli nami edim. But in a case where ultimately again the witnesses have been invalidated, what does it mean that the judges have also been de facto invalidated? So the Gemara says pasli nami edim vaha edim. Sorry, I keep on reading it wrong. So the Gemara says Ella. I'm sorry. Ella, migo de pasli dayani pasli nami edim. But in a case where ultimately, again, the judges have been invalidated, why would you say that migo, that the witnesses are invalidated as well? So the Gemara says, Vaha edim v'suleka. Once you don't have witnesses, you don't have a case. Lo zicha diika kat acheres. Once again, we revert back to what we said, where Ruvain is claiming that he has two sets of witnesses. Ha leka kat acheres mai. So if there's not a second set of witnesses, then what would you say? So Gemara says, Hachanami de la matzi pasli. You're right, in Achinami, then one litigant would not be able to invalidate the litigant's set of witnesses, because again, then he'd be no gay, he'd be conflicted. Hainu de Rav Dimi. But that's the same thing we just said before in the name of Rav Dimi. Ikebenayu migo demar savra amina migo umi sara lo amina migo. Okay, so the fundamental machlokes ultimately again would be whether or not we employ the concept of migo. So we'll say, so bottom line is we have multiple versions as to how to understand the first machlokes in the Mishnah. But one thing is clear, which is it's not a simple case to understand. So remember again, what we have over here is Rabbi Meir saying one litigant could disqualify the witnesses and the judges of the other litigant, and the Chachamim saying, no, you can't. What are the parameters of that case? It appears that the way the Gemara is settling over here is that the parameters of this case is where Ruvain is claiming that he has two sets of witnesses. So now Rabbi Meir says Shimon has the ability to come along and discredit the first set because he's not conflicted, because there's still a second set. Whereas the Chachamim say no. In general, the only way to disqualify witnesses is to go ahead and halacha l'maisa find something inherently disqualified about them. They're a relative, they're a thief, so on and so forth. Gufa. So let's go ahead. Go back to what the Gemara said before. Amr Shlokish. Peh kadosh yomar davar zeh. So it says, if you remember again, Reish Lakish had an interesting interpretation. Reish Lakish said that when Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah says that one litigant could go ahead and disqualify the witnesses of the other litigant, what was that talking about? An Eid Echad. Where the Gemara said Eid Echad. Right? Don't read it as a dove, rather read it as a dove. This was the end of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. That really, again, if all Reuven is furnishing is one witness, so Shimon has the ability to go ahead and disqualify that one witness. So Reish Lakish was surprised. Reish Lakish says, could it be that someone as great as Rabbi Meir would say such a thing like this? So the Gemara says, Reish Lakish, Pak Kadosh Yomar Davar Zeh. So the Gemara says, Tani Eido. Rather read it ultimately again as singular witness. Se'ini. So now the Gemara says something very interesting. Ini v'hamar ula haroes Reish Lakish bebeis medrash. So what's interesting over here is as follows. According to this Gemara, so leaving aside even the content, what you see from here is style. Reish Lakish is being incredibly deferential to Rabbi Meir. He says Rabbi Meir, he calls Rabbi Meir a pek kadosh, a holy mouth. Would a holy mouth say something like this, that one litigant could disqualify the witnesses of the other litigant, and therefore Reish Lakish says Rabbi Meir must have meant that one litigant could disqualify the singular witness of another litigant. But the point the Gemara is seizing on over here is Rabbi Meir is Reish Lakish is incredibly deferential to Rabbi Meir. But one second, the Gemara says, one second, that makes it sound like Rabbi Meir was greater than Reish Lakish. Yet the Gemara says, one second, if you were to walk into the base medrash, what would you see? Rabbi says, beautiful. Haroes Reish Lakish base medrash. If you would see Reish Lakish in the base medrash, what would you see? Kilu oker harim v'tochnan zeh bazeh. You would see someone that was literally uprooting mountains, and grinding them one against the other. So we'll say, so this is a metaphor for acute intellectual or analytical prowess. So remember again, the idea, if you remember again, when it comes to describing Talmidei Chachamim, there are two different types of Torah scholars. There's what's called the Sinai. A Sinai is someone who possesses a voluminous amount of knowledge, like a Har Sinai. And then there's an Oker Harim. Oker Harim is someone who possesses acute intellectual or analytical acumen. Someone's able to uproot mountains. Again, might not be the same repository of knowledge. Remember again, also we saw this Gemara. The Gemara says, who's greater, a Sinai or an Oker Harim? And what does the Gemara answer? Both. In other words, you need both. It's very nice to be able to engage in analytical, what's the right word? Analytical debates, or analytical process, right, or insightful analytical processes. But if you don't have the knowledge, it doesn't matter. So you need both. You need a Sinai and you need an Oker Harim. So the Gemara says over here, if you walk into the base medrash, you saw Reish Lakish, what would you see? You'd see someone uprooting mountains and what? And grinding them against the other. So we'll say, it's fascinating to understand, what does this mean? What kind of scholar was Reish Lakish? So Reish Lakish was the kind of person who was able to go ahead and challenge contemporary held beliefs. In other words, the ability to uproot mountains means the ability to analyze something, and to grind them against the other indicates the ability to think in new ways. Sometimes we become just so caught and so trapped in ways that we have done things that we lose the ability to look at things through a different kind of lens. So someone who could uproot mountains is the ability to analyze, grind them against each other, is the ability to think about things in a different way. So profound. So the Gemara says, and yet, Am Ravina, Valo Kol Roa, Remer Beis HaMedrash, Kilo Oker Harim, Tokran Zebozeh. So yet, Ravina said, Rabbi Meir was also someone who, if you walked into the base medrash, what would you see him doing? Uprooting mountains and grinding them one against the other. So I'll say, so it sounds like Reish Lakish was just as great as Rabbi Meir, and yet Reish Lakish was so deferential. First white line, Hachi Kamar, both says so beautiful, Hachi Kamar, Bo Urei, Kama Mechavin Zazah. See how much Rabbi Meir and Reish Lakish loved each other. So the Gemara says, say this idea that they were incredibly respectful to one another. Kiha tiyasiv Rebbe v'ka'amar asr lahat minas atzonis. Listen to this. Rebbe came along. Different story. Rebbe came along and Rebbe said, you are not permitted to insulate something called. We actually had this in our Hilchos Shabbos Chabura a couple of weeks back. The halacha is, there's an Isra on Shabbos called Hatmana. You're not allowed to insulate something. Now Rebbe came along and said, not only can you not insulate something to preserve warmth on Shabbos, you also can't insulate something to preserve cold on Shabbos. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that if we let you go ahead and insulate something cold, you come to insulate something hot as well. So the Gemara says, Amar lefan of Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Abba. So Amar lefan of Rabbi Shmuel, Amar lefan of Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi came and he said the following before Rabbi. He said, Abba, hitu hatmin asatzonim. So he says, Abba, my father Rabbi Yossi permitted one to insulate something cold. Amar lei. So Rabbi said, Kavar hora zakin. Oh, if Rabbi Yossi paskin that way, the elder has paskined. Nothing more to talk about. You're allowed to do it. So, what do you see? What do you see from here? See how much the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael loved each other. Did Rabbi Yossi Kayim Hayakafov V'Yoshev V'Fnei Rabbi. So what do you see from here? If Rabbi Yossi was alive, Rabbi Yossi himself would have been deferential in front of Rabbi. Tahar Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi Memali Makam Avosef Hava Vayakafov V'Yoshev Lifnei Rabbi V'Ka'amar Kvar Hora Zaken. So I say, even though Rabbi Yossi was deferential to Rabbi, yet when Rabbi heard the ruling of Rabbi Yossi, he deferred to Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara is painting a beautiful picture over here of Rabbanim who are deferential one to the other. So you see over here first, again, it started with our Gemara beforehand, that you see Reish Lakish being incredibly deferential to Rabbi Meir, called him a Pak Kadosh, a holy mouth, even though, again, Reish Lakish was just as great as Rabbi Meir. And I see over here Rabbi being deferential to Rabbi Yossi, even though Rabbi Yossi would have been deferential to Rabbi. Incredible. Amar Boshia. My Dichsiv. So we'll say, where do we see it? So the Gemara is painting this beautiful picture of the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael, Dafka of Eretz Yisrael, being incredibly deferential and respectful to one another. So the Gemara says, my Dichsiv, what's the pasuk? Dichsiv. V'ekach li shnei maklos. So it's actually very beautiful. This is a pasuk in Zechariah. I took for me two staffs. This is a prophetic vision of Zechariah. I took for me two staffs. Le'echad karasi Noam. One of the staffs I called Noam. U'le'echad karasi Chovlin. And the other I called Chovlin. Chovlin literally means damagers. Right? Damagers. So the Gemara says, Noam, who's Noam? Elu Talmidicham Sheberetz Yisrael. This refers, or actually Chovlin was like a mechabel, like he's a terrorist. The Noam, who's the pleasant one? Elu Talmidei Chacham Sheberetz Yisrael. This refers to the Torah scholars in Eretz Yisrael. Sheman imin ze lazeh b'halacha. They're pleasant to each other in halacha. They're pleasant to each other. Chovlim, who are the terrorists? Elu Talmidei Chacham Shebebavel. This refers to the Torah scholars in Bavel. Shemechablin ze lazeh b'halacha. That are just abrasive, contrarian, and almost like abusive to each other in halacha. So such a fascinating distinction here between the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael and the Rabbanim of Bavel. The Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael, loving, deferential, kind to each other. The Rabbanim of Bavel, literally again beating each other, not physically, but intellectually beating each other up. The Yomi Elai, so listen to this. Yomi Elai, Eila Shnei Bnei HaYitzhar HaOmdim Ushnaim Zeisim Allah Yitzhar. So we'll say, what is this prophetic vision? So again, this is also Zechariah. Am Rabbi Yitzchak. So again, it says, these are the sons of the olive oil, of the olive, referring to olive oil. That refers to Eile Talmidei Chacham Sheberetz Yisrael, Shinochen Zela Zeh B'Halacha, Kishem and Zayis. Right? So the olive oil is a reference ultimately again to the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael. Right? So olive oil is smooth, olive oil could be sweet. So these refer to the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael, ultimately again, who are kind to one another in halacha. So the Gemara says, but Ushnaim Zeis, in the two olive trees, Elu Talmidei Chacham Shebebavel, Shemerurin Zela Zeh B'Halacha, Kizayis. The olive tree, the olive leaves, on the other hand, is bitter. So that refers to who? That refers ultimately again to the Rabbanim of Bavel, who are bitter to one another. The Essa Einai. So we'll say it's fascinating, this distinction between the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael and the Rabbanim ultimately again of Bavel. So I'll just point out we do not have time for it today. We don't have time for it today, but there happens to be a beautiful piece by the Shem Mishmuel, the Sakhav Rebbe. And the Sakhav Rebbe says, why this distinction between the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael and the Rabbanim of Bavel? So the Sakhav Rebbe says it's very simple. It's the power of Eretz Yisrael. The power of Eretz Yisrael. That there is something about being in the land that has a greater intensity and a greater connection to the Ribono Shel Olam that fundamentally changes who and what you are. Both say, any person who has ever been zocha to step foot on the holy soil of Eretz Yisrael knows this. The moment, right, you're on the flight and you see the coastline of Tel Aviv as you come in, there's something that changes inside of you. There's something that fundamentally snaps in a good way inside of you. You come into the airport and you see that like Mashiach mezuzah over there, right? And you see that, and there's something that fundamentally changes within you. I didn't do anything. It's not like I learned more Torah like I did. The land fundamentally changes me. The Rabbi Shmuel says that accounts for the difference between the Talmidei Chacham of Eretz Yisrael and the Talmidei Chacham of Babel. Eretz Yisrael has you wouldn't know it, right, necessarily from the driving or from the personal interactions, but Eretz Yisrael has a soothing effect on the neshama. It does. That's why a person feels in a greater sense. I think for many of us, the only time we truly feel at peace is in Eretz Yisrael. Now again, you might say it's shkoyach, because when you're in Eretz Yisrael, you're on vacation, right? For many of us, it's not that, because a lot of times you can be on vacation and still all worked up and still not find any level of tranquility. But there's something about Eretz Yisrael that allows the neshama to be tranquil. So the Rabbi Shmuel says that's the difference between the Talmidim of Eretz Yisrael, the Talmidim of Babel. So the Gemara goes back to V'sa'inai ve'era v'nei shtei noshim yotzos v'ruach bekanfehem. So I'll say now the Gemara quotes another incredible vision, also from Zechariah. I lifted my eyes and I saw two women, yotzos v'ruach bekanfehem. So these were really like malachim, but they looked like women, right? The wind was under their wings. Ulahina knafayim kekanfei hachasida, and they had wings like the chasida bird. V'tisana ha'efa. And they lifted the Ifa. So again, Rashi points out the Ifa is the Yitzhahara between the heaven and earth. And I said to the Malach, where are they taking the Ifa? They're going to build a home in Eretz Shinar. So we'll say, so just to understand the vision, Zechariah is seeing two angels. They look like women. They have wings like the Chasida bird. They're lifting up. They're taking the Ifa. Rashi says Eifa is the Yitzhahara. And where are they putting the Eifa? In Eretz Shinar. What is it talking about? Zu Chanukah v'gasos. These two angels refer to Chanukah. So we'll say Chanukah is like false flattery, Chanukah, and gasos ruach, arrogance. Sheyardu leBavel. And both of these traits came down to Bavel. So the Gemara says, "V'gasas ruach leBavel nachis." Is that true that arrogance came to Bavel? V'amar asara kabin gasos yardu leolam. 10 kavim of arrogance came down to the world. Tisha notla elam. 9 of them came down to Persia. 9 of them came down to Persia. The achas kala olam kulo, and 1 was dispersed amongst the rest of the world. So we'll say, see from here, the arrogance came to Persia, not to Bavel. In leBavel nachas v'shtarbuvi d'shtarbuv liolim. It came down to Bavel, and from Bavel it spread out to the neighboring areas. Taikanami dichsiv livnos labayis be'aretz shinar shmamino. Okay, so the Gemara says, Mar. So I'll say, so just this. There's so much to say about this prophetic vision. There's this prophetic vision of these two malachim, or these two women, these two angelic figures representing flattery and arrogance. They have wings, right? They have wings. Because flattery and arrogance ultimately, again, could create inflated ego. And they're transporting the Yitzhahara to, again, in this case it was Persia or Bavel. That's where arrogance and flattery are found. V'amar similar gasas haruach anios, v'anios leBavel nachis. So the Gemara says, v'anios leBavel nachis. So the Gemara says, 1 second, a siman is fascinating. A siman, a sign for arrogance is poverty. Is poverty. They will say now, what's the pshat that a sign for arrogance is poverty? So on a simple level, that sometimes a person who is so arrogant thinks that work is beneath him. So, something interesting happens if you think work is beneath you, which is you don't make money. So the Gemara says, but 1 second, but v'anios leBavel nachis, but did poverty come to Bavel? So the Gemara says, my anios, what does anios mean? Anios Torah. It refers to not necessarily material poverty, but rather again spiritual poverty. Dichsev achos lanu kitano shadayim ein la. Am Rabbi Yochanan zu Elaim. This refers to Elaim, which is Persia. Shezachsa limod v'lo zachsa lilamed. So Elaim, apparently Persia, was the source. There was much Torah that was learned there, but ultimately, again, they did not have the ability to convey Torah at all. My Bavel, what's Bavel? Am Rabbi Yochanan, Belula b'Mikra, Belula b'Mishnah, Belula b'Talmud. Ultimately, again, literally, again, it's mixed in. There's Torah there, there's Mishnah there, and there's Talmud there. B'machshakim hoshivani k'mesei olam. So literally, again, the pasuk over here quotes the idea from Eicha. So literally, in the darkness, I have been led like the dead of the world. Rabbi Yirmiyah ze Talmuda shel Bavel. This refers ultimately again to the learning in Bavel. So I want to point out a fascinating dynamic that's unfolding over here. So on one hand, what the Gemara is painting over here is this tremendous picture, this dichotomy between the Torah of Eretz Yisrael and the Torah of Bavel, right? That the Talmidei Chacham of Bavel are abusive, are abrasive, there's arrogance, there's haughtiness, and yet in Eretz Yisrael there's serenity, there's kindness, and there's serenity, kindness, and the spiritual elation. Yet it's fascinating to see, by the way, how Talmud Bavli becomes the more authoritative source of Torah learning, more than Talmud Yerushalmi, which is quite fascinating. So I'll say what you see from here is that sometimes in order to be able to arrive at emes, to be able to arrive at truth, so sometimes the midah that you need is not kindness, but sometimes in order to be able to arrive at truth, the midah that you need is a shtickle abrasiveness. So I was saying, we see this, by the way, right? When there's kindness, when everything is just about being kind and being accepting and being open, so the issue is you can't find emes, because if everything is emes, then nothing is emes. But yet, sometimes to be able to find what truth is, you have to be able to be a little bit abrasive. There has to be an ability to say, no, you're wrong and you're right, and I'm right and you're wrong, or I'm wrong and you're right. And it can't be that everyone... It's interesting. So on one hand, we're extolling the beautiful shalom of Eretz Yisrael, but yet, again, it's not that serenity that allows us to arrive at the truest form of Torah. Truest form of Torah requires emes, and emes sometimes requires a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit of abrasiveness to be able to kind of sift through all the stuff that's not emes, in order to be able to get to true emes. Incredible. All right, so much more to say on this. We have to go back to Mishnah. Amar lo. So we actually quoted this Gemara on Amud Aleph of yesterday's daf. Amar lo. Neman alai Abba, Neman alai Avicha. So let's say Reuven and Shimon have a din Torah together, right? And Reuven says, you know what? I am willing to accept my father or your father as a judge. And both litigants agree with this. Or Neman alai Shlosha Roi Bakar. Or I'm willing to accept the beis din of 3 shepherds. So, which normally shepherds would not be qualified to serve on a beis din. Rabbi Meir Omer Yachal Lachzerbo. Rabbi Meir says that even after they make this decision, they could retract. They could retract. We'll see exactly when they could retract about this. The Chacham say no. Chacham say no. Once you commit to a process, that's it. You remain committed. So again, let's say again, Reuven was obligated, was liable to Shimon in a shvua in beis din. V'amar lo dar li b'chayi roshecha. So let's say, so normally remember again, if you're chayiv for a shvua, the way you take a shvua in the beis din is in front of a court, holding on to a sefer Torah. But let's say again, even though Reuven was chayiv to Shimon in a shvua, Shimon says, you know what? Just come over to my house, swear to me in my house. An outside of beis din shvua, which is much less severe. So again, Rabbi Meir Omer Yachal Achzerbo. Rabbi Meir says that Shimon could retract. That Shimon could say, no, Reuven, I want you to swear to me in beis din. The Chacham say, no, once you come into a process, Eino Yachal Achzerbo. You cannot go ahead and you cannot retract once you committed. Okay, says Gemara, Amrav Dimi Breid Rav Nachman, Breid Rav Yosef, Kigon, Tekabli Alei Bechad. So what's the case over here? The case is, so going back to the first case, right? Reuben and Shimon go to beis din, and Reuben says to Shimon, you know what? I'm willing to accept your father or my father as a judge. And if both parties agree to that, that's fine, even though obviously a relative would normally be possible. So now Rav Dimi says in the name of Rav Nachman, when is this? When they're accepting the father as one of the tribunal of 3. So they're accepting him as part of the beis din. So ultimately, again, where's the machlokes? So the machlokes ultimately, again, is in a case of what we call macholach. What's macholach? If you look at Rashi says Reuven's coming to Shimon, and Reuven says to Shimon, you know, if I go ahead and I lose the case, I'm hereby mochel the property that is in your possession. So since Shimon already has the item in his possession, so therefore it's almost as if they're both. Look at Rashi. Let me read instead of reading something else. Macholach itovea amar lenitva. So if the claimer is saying to the claimant, Ne'eman alai abba o avicha im yizakucha yehi macholach. If I win the din, ultimately again, I'll mochel that which is in your possession. Hasam kami rabbanan ini yochel lachzerbo. In that case, the rabbanan say that the litigants cannot retract. Right? Reuven can't retract. Because Shimon, so to speak, has already partially acquired the item that is in his hand. But if again the claim is that if I lose the case, I will give to you. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, there is the ability to go ahead and recant or retract. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Even if he says I'll give it to you, that's also machlokes. It's also machlokes. Say bailuhu betin lecha machlokes am machalocha divrei hakol and yochel achzerbo. So now the Gemara asks the question: in the case of etin lecha, that's machlokes Ramir and the Chachamim. But in the case of machalocha, everyone agrees that neither party could retract upon the agreed upon structure. O dilma beinzu machlokes, or maybe either way there's machlokes. So Tashma the Amarava Rava said machlokes be'etin lecha. The machlokes is when the case is where I will give you. Ava b'machol lecha. But where there is mechila, in other words, where the party, let's say again, Reuven says to Shimon, if I lose, you could keep the item that is already in your possession. Divrei hakol in yochel achzerbo. So Amit Bishlama, if you say the following, Amit Bishlama be'etin lecha machlokes, then the machlokes is only in a case where Reuven claims, if I lose, I will give you something. But where again, essentially, if Reuven loses, Shimon is allowed to hold on to the item. Then they can't retract on this legal framework. So Rav Damar Rabbi Yochanan, that makes sense. But if you hold the halacha l'maisa, there's machlokes whether it's etein lecha or machol lecha. Rav Damar Kaman. Who is Rava holding like? To which the Gemara says, Rava time of the nafshei kama. Rava would be espousing his own position, not aligning himself with any of the aforementioned positions. So let's say back to Reuven and Shimon. So we'll say, so again, remember, just to appreciate what it is that's unfolding over here. The Mishnah is introducing us to a new legal concept. The legal concept is, and actually it's intuitive, if both parties agree upon a compromised legal framework for the resolution of their issue, they could do that. So, for example, Reuven and Shimon come to Beis Din. Reuven says to Shimon, you know what? I like your father. Seems like a smart guy. I agree to submit to a tribunal, to a Beis Din, even though your father sits on that Beis Din. Now, normally, if Shimon's father is on the Beis Din, what's the halacha? It doesn't work. He's a karov. But the Mishnah is introducing to us the idea that if they both agree to the process, then halacha l'maisa, it works. Then the shaila becomes, can either party subsequently renege on that? That's the machlokes. Can either party subsequently renege? That's the shaila. That's the shaila. So I'll say, so that's the machlokes, Rabbi Meir, and the Chachamim. Rabbi Meir says that he can renege. Chacham say he can't renege. And then the shaila becomes, under what circumstances can the renegation, I don't know if that's a word, but can the renegation occur? Okay, so that's what we're doing over here. So the Gemara goes like this. The Gemara says, so let's say Reuven owed Shimon a shvua and in Beis Din, and Shimon says, just come over to my house. You can swear to me in my house. So then what's the halacha? And then Rabbi Meir says, Yachal Achzerbo. Rabbi Meir says that Shimon could say, I changed my mind, come to Beis Din and do the Shavua. The Chum say, In Yachal Achzerbo. The Chum say, no, he can't change his mind. I'm a Beis. My love, Va'osan Hanishba'in V'lo Mishalmin. Are we not talking about a case where again the Shavua would essentially exempt Shimon from payment? And therefore, the Havli Kamachalach. This is a case of forgiveness, and therefore, again, that's why he can't retract. Whereas lo be'etein ba'osan hanishba'im v'notlin. Not necessarily. This could also be a case of where, again, the party has to take a shvua, is taking a shvua, and then taking property. That is like a case of etein l'cha. I v'hatana l'reisha tana tola b'das acherim v'tana b'dalas das asmo. What about the reisha case? We're talking about two different cases. One is the case ultimately again of tola b'das acherim. That would be the case of Abba and Avicha. And ultimately, again, one is talking about Tola B'das Atzmo, that's where halacha l'maisa again. That's the case of where it's dependent on the litigants themselves. Utzricha, I need both cases. If we're just at the case of Abba and Avicha, where it's dependent on other people, Rabbi Meir says you could retract. Why? Mishum delo gamar umakne. Because there was no formal kinyan involved in that. The Gemara says, the amar mi yemar demizakile. About Tola B'das Atzmo, but in the case of Tola B'das Atzmo, Ema Modi Le Rabbanon, ultimately Meir would agree with the Rabbanon. V'yashmoinan Baha, if we just said the other case, Baha Kamri Rabbanon Babahi, Ema Modi Le Rabbanon Meir, therefore Tzricha. I will say, so I apologize, I know we're like going at breakneck speed over here. But again, so I apologize for that. But again, just to understand, we're just trying to figure out halacha l'maisa, which cases do we allow for retraction, which cases don't we allow for retraction. So essentially, we'll have to stop over here. I'm going to record the rest of this daf and Yahrzeit Hashem up to the Mishnah before Shabbos. That Shabbos, there's a fighting chance of getting through the block. So we'll say, but just understand what we're leaving off with. What we're leaving off with is as follows. We've established a reality. The reality is that halacha l'maisa, two parties could buy in to what we call a compromised legal construct, which allows them to use legal mechanisms which would normally be invalid for use, right? Like using a relative as a dayan, or like taking a shavua outside of Beis Din. Those things can be done. They can be done. However, what's the shaila? The shaila is, can either party subsequently retract or not? That's the machlokes. Rabbi Meir says yes, right? Or recant is better. Rabbi Meir says yes, the Chachamim say no. Then the machlokes becomes what? Under what circumstances can, according to Rabbi Meir, who says you can retract your right, you can retract your allegiance to a compromised system. Under what circumstances can you retract? And Meir Hashem from the rest of the recording today's daf will get clarity on that. We'll say shkoyach.